So this is the last lecture in the Gilded Age, really running from the end of the Civil War all the way up to the turn of the 20th century. So we've seen Reconstruction, we've seen Indian Wars, we've seen farmer discontent, we've seen industrialization, we've seen immigration, and now we're going to see sort of looking outwards, expansionism, sometimes called imperialism, as the United States will potentially seek to develop an empire like most Western European countries had already been involved in Asia and Africa. So when you look at the arguments for expansion, you're going to see the ideas of Frederick Jackson Turner. And we looked at his frontier thesis when we were looking at sort of the quote unquote West. And remember, he had said the frontier is gone. Wasn't entirely true, but in his idea, since the frontier was gone, the frontier had always been sort of a motivating, democratizing, sort of rebirth experience. Now America needed to find new frontiers in which to continue to do what it had always done, which was to exercise its expansive character, spread democratic ideals, again, going back to that sort of manifest destiny, and also to capitalize on its investments and also its Christian beliefs. So again, sort of that whole idea of moving west that we'd always seen before. You're going to have political and economic leaders who are going to look at the industrialization that has happened and are going to say, you know what, we need to have foreign territories. We might have to take them by force if necessary, because we need vital raw materials such as rubber, tin, copper, palm oil, and dyes in order for us to continue our industrialization. We need to be able to get supplies that we couldn't find maybe here in the United States. And then you're going to have manufacturers and commercial farmers, more of those bonanza farmers that we had talked about before. And they're increasingly dependent on international trade because they want to be able to send their goods abroad and make their money. And in order to be able to send their goods abroad, they require an expanded force of warships to protect their what we call merchant vessels. And at the same time, you're going to need a modern steam-powered navy with ocean bases really in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, where ships that are traveling around the world could replenish their coal and water supplies. So by the late 1800s, nearly everyone else, namely all the other big countries in Europe, seemed to be already involved in the imperialism game. Obviously, we know that Britain, going all the way back to us being part of the British Empire, but you got the French, the Belgians, the Italians, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Germans, had conquered and sort of carved up most of Asia and Africa already. And onto the scene comes somebody called Alfred Thayer Mahan. I call him ATM, in some ways to remember sort of that he had this money idea. And in his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and he's looking backwards, so he's looking back 1660 to 1783, he's looking backwards in order to come up with a plan for going forwards. And he argues that in looking at these countries that had great sea power, national greatness flowed from naval power. And he insisted that industrial development, which the United States had really begun in this Gilded Age, was going to require a powerful navy that was going to have huge battleships, a strong merchant marine. Those are ships, again, that are not the Navy, but are transporting goods around the world, foreign commerce, and colonies to provide raw materials and new markets for American products, and global naval bases. So again, he really sort of articulates the blueprint that other people, particularly Teddy Roosevelt, are really going to latch onto. And ATM championed that America's destiny was to control the Caribbean Ocean, okay? Really for the goal of building a canal across Central America to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. He also thought that it would be wise to acquire Hawaii and the Philippines and spread American values and investments across the Pacific, really with that goal of getting to China. So China is what we call the illimitable markets, huge opportunity. So if you get to Hawaii, and particularly in terms of having a coaling station there so you can refuel, and then the Philippines right there on the doorstep of China. Now, social Darwinism, which we know was Herbert Spencer's sort of bastardization of Darwin's original scientific ideas, really takes that from the rich people level to even the corporation level now to sort of the country level. And the social Darwinism, as it applied to countries, the idea was among nations, as among individuals, really only the strongest nations survive. And it was really that the Anglo-Saxons, again, these Western European nations, as well as countries that had Western Europeans like the United States, were superior, and that the English-speaking race was destined to dominate the globe and transform these backward races. And while Tyndall doesn't talk about it, much of this idea can be boiled down to something called the white man's burden that had been written by Rudyard Kipling, sort of, again, that, you know, there needs to be country or countries that sort of look after the poorer, inferior countries and tell them how to get better. Okay? And so we're going to look first at Hawaii, because there have been Americans in Hawaii for a lot longer than perhaps we've thought about. American missionaries had been there spreading Christianity, and there had been what we call a reciprocal trade agreement between the Kingdom of Hawaii, again, it's got royalty, and the United States, that made it so that Hawaii's sugar could come into the United States duty-free. That means without tariffs. And in exchange for getting that really good deal without tariffs, there was a guarantee that none of the Hawaiian Islands would be leased or granted to another country. So the Hawaiian Islands would keep their independence, the United States wouldn't lose them to anybody else, and in return, they'd get this sort of excellent duty-free status. Now, sugar production boomed with whites really leading the way, with Chinese and Japanese laborers helping produce this sugar. And the white sugar planters formed this economic elite. And by the 1890s, the native Hawaiian population had really been reduced to a small minority by smallpox and other foreign diseases, much as we'd seen it happen to natives here in the continent. Now, there's a queen called Queen Liliuokalani who looked at the situation and said, you know what, this is sort of a step 7, maybe not pan-native alliance, because really the Hawaiians were all pretty united in the islands, but she looked at the situation and said, there are way too many whites making money here, and this is not good for us. So she tried to restrict the growing political power that had been exercised by these American sugar planters. And so you're going to see a process where the Hawaiian white population, known as haoles, overthrew the monarchy. So they overthrew Queen Liliuokalani with the help of U.S. Marines. And within a month, a committee that represents the white elites came to D.C. to ask to annex the islands, much as we had seen in Texas. You know, hey, we're ready to go. You know, can we be part of you? At the time, the president, Benjamin Harrison, sent an annexation treaty to the Senate as he's leaving office, so sort of gets the ball rolling. But the new president, Grover Cleveland, who is a Democrat, looks at what's going on and says, you know what, I need to get a better look. So he sends a special commissioner to Hawaii that comes back with a report that said that the Americans that were there, the sugar planters, along with the Marines, had acted improperly, and that in fact, that most native Hawaiians opposed annexation. So now you have two sides of the story, what the whites want and what the Hawaiians want. So it gets put on the back burner and nothing happens. However, when William McKinley becomes president in 1897, again a Republican, he annexes Hawaii as part of this overall expansion effort that is going on at the time. So Hawaii becomes part of the fold. And that's important because it's going to provide a really strategic, like I said, refueling station pretty much halfway across the Pacific between the United States West Coast and Asia. Now we're going to, instead of focusing to the west as we were to Hawaii, we're going to go southeast of Florida, just 90 miles, looking at Cuba. And so throughout the second half of the 19th century, the Cubans had repeatedly revolted against the Spanish, and they'd been crushed each time. And again, remember the Spanish control of Cuba goes all the way back to Columbus in the late 1400s. But by the late 1800s, the Spanish Empire is really on its last legs. And again, we'd seen a number of colonies rise up in the early 1800s. That was part of the whole idea of the Monroe Doctrine. But now we're seeing Cuba try it. And America's sugar and mining companies were heavily invested in Cuba. Despite the fact that it was Spanish-owned, there were Americans who were quite involved. In fact, America traded more with Cuba than Spain actually did. And American owners of sugar plantations were very concerned about the security of their investments with all the volatility that was going on in Cuba. So in 1895, the Cubans rose up again, much as they had done a number of times. And tens of thousands of Cuban peasants would actually die of combat wounds and disease and starvation in this sort of final uprising. And you've got two big newspaper publishers, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. Hearst has got the New York Journal. Pulitzer's got the New York World, and both are trying to outdo each other with sensational headlines about what's going on in Cuba. Many were fake headlines, some were real, and this was actually called yellow journalism. And they really both hoped that they could use what was going on in Cuba to help them sell papers. And Hearst specifically thought that he had enough juice, enough power, that he had the power to sort of manipulate public opinion to get war started. So reporters from both newspapers were sent to Cuba to distort, exaggerate, and even make up stories to attract more readers. So using this opportunity to try to get yourself a war so they could sell more papers. Now, McKinley looks at what's going on between Spain and Cuba, and he claims neutrality, doesn't want to get involved. But he does indicate that he's sympathetic to the rebels. Again, we have cousins in rebellion, just as we had rebelled all the way back in 1776. But he doesn't want war. Now, there's a ship, the USS Maine, that is docked in Havana, but it's not there for military reasons, and it mysteriously explodes in the Havana harbor. More than 250 people die. Now, 75 years later, it's going to actually be ruled that it was accidental from an internal explosion. But at the time, everybody assumed that it was a treachery of the Spanish. And immediately, Congress authorizes $50 million to prepare for combat, but they don't declare war. That's important. Again, okay? McKinley thinks it's an accident and actually tries negotiating with the Spanish. And he doesn't want to deal with Teddy Roosevelt, who's actually the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who'd later be his vice president, because he thinks Teddy is just so eager to go to war. And Teddy's whipping up antagonism towards Spain. To the hell with Spain, remember the Maine, just this whole idea that we got to go get Spain. And the Spanish government actually agrees to pretty much every American demand regarding Cuba, but the public sentiment and cries for revenge from both the Democrats and the Republicans led McKinley to finally ask for the authority to use armed forces to end the fighting in Cuba. And Congress declares Cuba independent from Spain. Not necessarily something the United States has the power to do, but they basically say Cuba should be independent. And the Spanish government then looks at the situation and is like, well, those are fighting words, and they break diplomatic ties with the United States. The United States begins to blockade Cuban ports. And then ultimately Spain declares war. So as soon as Spain declares war on the United States, the U.S. then declares war on Spain. And there's an amendment, however, to the war resolution that's important. It's called the Teller Amendment. And we like to think of the Teller Amendment as something that is told. So what is told to the world, even to Spain and to Cuba, but to everybody else is, listen, the United States in this war has no intention of annexing Cuba. So we're here to free Cuba, but to not annex Cuba. Now, this war itself, called by Secretary of State John Hay a splendid little war, because it takes less than 4 months, the United States sort of transitions from, defending its neighbor 90 miles away to starting to become potentially an imperial power. And the question is, how does the Philippines get involved when we're, quote-unquote, fighting a war against Spain over Cuba? Well, Philippines was owned by Spain and had been part of the Spanish Empire. And the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the aforementioned Teddy Roosevelt, says, I got a great idea, okay? We could actually stand to gain more from this than just sort of helping the Cubans be free. So he orders a guy named Commodore George Dewey, who's the commander of the U.S. Asiatic Squadron of ships. And he says, go to Manila, engage the Spanish forces in the Philippines, just sort of in case we end up going to war with Cuba. Go to war over Cuba. So we're not even at war yet, but he's putting us in a position that we could sort of get this new land if, in fact, we go to war with Spain over Cuba, but we could get other potentially Spanish lands. So Dewey goes to Manila Bay. He has modern warships, 6 of them, and they very quickly dispatch the antiquated Spanish fleet. The United States easily takes Manila Bay, but they don't have any soldiers to go ashore, so they sort of have to sit there waiting for months for reinforcements. And you've got German and British warships that are just circling so that they could take the Philippines if the United States did not. Now, there's an important figure on the scene named Emilio Aguinaldo, who's basically an exiled leader of the Filipino nationalist movement, and he declares the Philippines independent. He's going to be a great ally of the United States in the Philippines to fight off the Spanish. So with Algonado's help, Dewey's forces end up entering Manila and pretty quickly accept the surrender of the Spanish troops. So the question is going to be, sort of now that you've got the Philippines and you've defeated the Spanish there, what do you end up doing with the Philippines? We'll talk about that much more in part 2.